Turning to session one, overview of cross-border human mobility. We're going to start very basic. Who is a migrant? How is migrant defined? The UN Migration Agency, the International Organization for Migration, or IOM, defines a migrant as any person who's moving or has moved across an international border or within a state away from his or her habitual place of residence, regardless of the person's legal status, whether the movement is voluntary or involuntary, what the causes for the movement are, or what the length of the stay is. So this is a very broad definition of a migrant. It wouldn't apply if you're crossing a border to do some shopping, but if you're moving across a border to reside across a border, you are a migrant. Doesn't matter what your nationality is, doesn't matter where you're coming from, and it doesn't even matter how long you stay. This is about the broadest definition of migrants. Sometimes this same organization I've seen will use a sort of a 12-month standard for various metrics that they use to consider residing in a place for 12 months or more to count as a migrant. And while this definition specifies that even moving within a country from one residence to another in a different region or part of a country technically counts as migration, but it's internal migration. That is not the migration that we're concerned with in this course. It's typically also not what the International Organization for Migration focuses on. Cross-border migration is what we are interested in this course. A bit of background, and again, don't hesitate to jump in with questions or observations. How can we think about the global governance of migration, or from a high level? I think a starting point is to think about the UN Charter, right? In 1945, right after World War II, the UN Charter establishes the United Nations along with a large number of treaty articles for all members to adhere to. And the fundamental principle of the United Nations Charter is national sovereignty. And national sovereignty is prioritized over migration, that's for sure. In international law, there is no universal human right to enter another country. There are a lot of human rights. You may be familiar with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and some of the other treaties that have come out in the last 70 years pertaining to human rights. And with a lot of human rights, sometimes they exist on paper, but they're not always respected in practice. You think, of course, there are human rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. There are human rights, to be free from torture and persecution and all these sorts of human rights that are documented and enumerated, but not always enforceable. Very often these rights exist on paper, but there's not proper enforcement of them across the board. Well, this is not the case with migration rights. There aren't even any rights on paper to enter another country or to migrate to another country. It's just it just doesn't exist as a recognized or established right. But there are some narrow precedents that have been carved out in treaty form, which do mandate some requirements on the part of receiving states. And two examples of that are the Refugee Convention of 1951, and we could also point to the European Union Schengen Agreement. So the Refugee Convention is an example of establishing a right to enter another country, even sort of it puts a burden or a responsibility or an obligation on a receiving country to receive asylum seekers, to hear their asylum claim. If the Refugee Convention does not require that states accept all refugees and take in all refugees, but it requires that they hear their claims and they evaluate their asylum claim based on a set of criteria. And if it matches what's spelled out in the Refugee Convention, typically around state persecution, if the asylum seeker is fleeing state persecution, then it becomes incumbent on the host country to accept them as a refugee. So that is a burden imposed by international law through treaty on states to allow folks into their country under very particular circumstances. Whereas otherwise, of course, the norm of national sovereignty prevails, which says that States have complete authority over their borders and migration policy. The Schengen Agreement in the European Union is a good example too, because what the member states who signed on to the Schengen Agreement agreed to is that they would abolish internal border controls between their own countries. So a bloc of countries in the EU said, we'll take on this Schengen Agreement, meaning that any person in any of the countries as part of the agreement can move from country to country without needing to produce ID or having to go through any sort of process at the border. Essentially, border controls have been lifted for human mobility in the region of the EU. And that's an example where, through treaty, countries are become obligated to allow passage from one side to the other. But over, over and above that, the norm is that national sovereignty is the primary principle at work here. Don't hesitate to share any questions, right? If they're relevant. In the period from the 1970s through the 1990s, in Western culture, in many Western countries, there was expanded support for immigration and for reducing border controls. Think of this as coinciding with sort of the heyday of globalization optimism. We're in the period of new technologies, commercial air travel, the internet, all of these sorts of things, and the idea is that people should be able to move too. So there was a lot of positive, proactive policy support to improve immigration channels and to welcome asylum seekers in need. In the 21st century, trends have been a little bit going the other direction, at least politically. States have been walking back discourses of openness, and they've been somewhat sidestepping moral and legal responsibilities, particularly under the Refugee Convention. We'll look at some examples of this later on. Why in the 21st century? We've seen a bit of a rise of nativism or a national sentiment that want more exclusive borders, that want to curtail and restrict the flow of people into the country. Of course, a lot of the pressure to turn back to borders in the 21st century followed the terrorist attacks of 9/11, when security and border control became a very large issue again. And in this slide, we're starting at the top, looking at a few major issues pertaining to global migration or movement of people across borders. Today, there are more people forcibly displaced than ever before, at 45 million people, according to the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR. And also, I'll add too that I'll be posting these slides onto Brightspace for students to look at as well. After today's session, I'll upload this onto the Brightspace slide for today's session. Issues of migration inequality loom large. The most mobile people today are more mobile than ever, and the most immobile people are more immobile than ever. So think about the billionaires and their access to private jets and travel around the world. Not just the billionaires, but the whole business class, even indeed the academic class, academics traveling to conferences around the world. It's very easy for affluent folks with the right passport today to travel widely and quickly. But for those lacking that social status or class or the correct passport, it is often more difficult than ever to cross borders. Part of this is related to the proliferation of border walls worldwide. That is, segments of borders between countries where there are significant infrastructure in terms of fencing or walls to restrict passage. Today, there are estimated to be more than 70 significant border walls, compared to just about 15 at the end of the Cold War. There have been more than 67,000 migrant deaths since 2014. So in the last 10 years, tens of thousands of people have gone missing or been identified as killed in the process of trying to cross borders. A large majority of these have been crossing the Mediterranean. migrants from North Africa and the Middle East trying to get across the Mediterranean to reach Europe. The Mediterranean Sea has become, in many ways, a graveyard for migrants. And the second most deadly border in the world does anybody want to guess what the second most deadly border region in the world is in terms of the number of individuals lost or that die trying to cross a border area? Any guesses of the second most deadly border region?
I think it's Turkey. And Chad has also said the US.
I think Turkey is up there, but in terms of absolute numbers, it is the US-Mexico border, and the amount of people from Mexico and Latin America, Central America, South America trying to enter the United States is not quite as high as the lives lost in the Mediterranean region, but it's a close second. In issues of migration management today, the question of climate change looms large. The issue of climate-induced migration or even climate refugees is something that academics and policymakers have been struggling with. And it's controversial because there are questions about just how many people are actually moving because of climate-related issues. And does it make sense to perhaps introduce a new category of refugee? The existing category of refugee applies to folks who are politically persecuted by a state. It does not include people who move because, say, for example, the coastline has eroded and their home community is lost due to rising sea levels. And if they have to move or flee to another country, technically they do not count as a refugee under international law because it's not state persecution that they're fleeing. So there are questions about whether or not there should be new categories of refugees introduced into international law to facilitate the reception of asylum claims for folks fleeing climate change. This is a bit of a controversial suggestion, though, because it could be that people who are moving because of climate-induced factors are also economic migrants. Do we have a separate category for economic migrants who are moving for economic opportunity, which may be related to changes in the climate? So how do we carve these categories up and think about classifying different migrants and refugees? The world has pretty much bounced back from the COVID-19 closures of 2020 and 2021. There was a significant interruption in some sectors of migration, but it was only temporary as the mobility of people across borders has jumped back right away and continues to be in a sort of an increase. The numbers are continue to increase. During the COVID closures, the only real flows of people across borders was sort of tourism travel, international students, and refugee claims dropped, and economic migrants dropped. But folks who were considered essential workers or had worked on the other side of a border, so not trying to migrate, but just trying to commute across borders, borders remained open to those people who were crossing borders to work throughout the COVID period. And of course, for issues of trade, the borders largely remained open too. But if you were trying to cross a border for any other reason than to get to your place of employment, there was a major disruption to cross-border traffic in that period. In the contemporary era as well, we're seeing a proliferation of technologies, security measures, biometrics, pre-clearance programs, and bordering far from the boundary line. So technology allows for people to sort of begin their process of crossing a border long before they ever actually embark on the journey and far from the border that they're actually aiming to cross. You can begin to submit identification so that you can pass very quickly through border controls. You sort of set the time frame in advance, and people are able to begin crossing borders well in advance of and far away from the actual international border. So we're seeing bordering happening. Bordering is the sort of the act of establishing a border or determining which jurisdiction an individual falls under is happening very far from the borderline. You just have to think about if you've ever been on an international flight, they start handing out those immigration, the customs cards while you're still in the air. If you're on a cruise line, well, before you arrive at a country, you begin going through the border clearance processes. And states, for security reasons, are conducting checks of passengers who are destined to arrive at a particular country. They're conducting sort of their questioning travelers at the point of departure in the departure country, far from where the actual border is. So technology is allowing for the process of bordering to be spread out in time and space. And we're seeing increasing border defiance, subversion of borders, from clandestine migration, think unauthorized migration, irregular migration, or illegal migration, it's sometimes called. This is for individuals who, well, sneak across a border, avoiding official crossings. And it also includes people who overstay their visas. Maybe someone gets a tourist visa or a work visa or a student visa. And when it runs out, they don't check in and return or leave the country. They just sort of drop off the grid and continue to stay, even though their visa has expired. That would be unauthorized migration. Human trafficking is another form of border subversion. And border protest, the actual demonstrations and direct action targeting borders of individuals protesting border closures is something that we're seeing in a lot of parts of the world too. Some numbers. This is from the International Organization of Migration. Currently in the world, there's an estimated 281 million migrants. That refers to how many people are living in a country that is not their country of origin. So that doesn't mean that's how many people cross borders this year. That means today how many folks are living in a country other than their country of origin. They may have been there for 30 years, they may have been there for 12 months. Most of those international migrants, as you can see, are centered around three regions: North America, Europe, and Asia. Smaller numbers in Latin America and the Caribbean, in Africa and Oceania. To break down that 281 million migrants worldwide, that constitutes about 3.6% of the world's population. So about 3 or 4 of every person in the world is a migrant. And of that number, the large majority of them are migrant workers, people whose primary purpose for crossing the border and residing in another country is employment, with something like 169 million migrant workers. This amounts to a lot of remittances as folks send money back to their home country, an estimated 831 billion US dollars in remittances in 2023. For many countries, remittances are a major part of their economy. Also included in this 281 million figure is 45 million forced migrants. This includes refugees, including refugees who have been settled. For example, in Canada, Canada has settled a relatively large number of refugees from Syria in the wake of the Syrian civil war. Something like 40,000 asylum seekers from Syria, maybe even 50 or 60,000 now have been resettled across Canada. So they would be included in this 45 million figure. It also includes asylum seekers, those whose refugee claims have not yet been determined or accepted, but are going through the process to become a refugee. Under international law, that the refugee category is very clear that refugee doesn't just refer to somebody fleeing trouble. It has a very technical definition. It refers to an asylum seeker whose claim to receive asylum has been adjudicated and approved. And once an asylum seeker's claim is adjudicated based on determining that they meet the criteria of demonstrating that they're fleeing state persecution, then they can potentially become a refugee. So this includes the refugees who have been resettled, asylum seekers seeking refugee status, and a small number of other cases that are related to refugees and asylum seekers, but for various reasons, don't fit neatly into international categories. We'll talk more about that when we look at the question of refugees and asylum seekers later this week. A large number, but difficult to pin down exactly, of the 281 million migrants are those who have come for family reunification or family unification. So spouses come, and children come, or parents will be brought over. And as those individuals migrate to join with their families, they fall into the category of family migrants. It's difficult to pin some of these down because there's a little bit of overlap. Sometimes individuals might fall into two of these categories at the same time. So, someone might be a family member, but also seeking employment in the country where they arrive at. So they're both a migrant worker, but also sometimes counted as a family migrant. There's about 6 million international students at the time, at the present time. And the hardest number to estimate is the number of unauthorized migrants in the world. How many folks are off the grid? How many folks are living below the radar of the state, not checking in with customs or immigration services, and basically residing in a country without authorization from the state? Best estimates are something like 30 to 50 million, maybe 40 million unauthorized migrants, large numbers in the US, of course, and other parts of the world. This is a slide from a table taken from one of the World Migration Reports 2024. And what I like about this slide is it provides a snapshot of the growth of a lot of these numbers, comparing the 2000 numbers with the 2024 numbers. So we can see that the number of migrants around the world has almost doubled from 2000, from 150 million to 281 million. The proportion of the world's population that are migrants has creeped up from about 2.8% to 3.6% of the global population. And we can see across the board there how some of these numbers have shifted, gone up, or in some cases gone down. In the case of children who are migrants, that number seems to be lower today than it was in the year 2000. The amount of remittances has gone up in orders of magnitude from 128 billion to 831 billion. The number of refugees in the world has soared from about 14 million in the year 2000 to 35 million today. And that's just the number of formal refugees, not counting asylum seekers and other folks who have been forcibly displaced. The number of refugees worldwide was dramatically increased around 2015, 2016, with the refugee crisis centered around North Africa and the Middle East, when due to political instability, millions of people were forced from their homes and tried to flee to other countries. And it was, I think, it was the year 2016 when the total number of displaced people across borders in the world for the first time topped the number post-World War II. Right after World War II, there was a record number of displaced people in the world. And that number was not surpassed until 2017. Maybe it was the 2016 year. I can't remember, but it was right in there about midway or latter part of the 2010s that the global number of displaced people actually surpassed the previous record, which was the immediately post-World War II era. And then it also includes the number of internally displaced people, those who have been forced from their homes, but not beyond a border. That's a category that we're not so interested in this, since this is, of course, about borders. We're not going to talk so much about internally displaced people. So those are, I hope that provides just a basic overview. I wanted to have a general introduction to this course that provides sort of a bird's eye view of some of the major facts and figures and issues pertaining to the management of borders and bodies today. And before I think probably we're scheduled to take our first break. I think we are aiming to go for 80 minutes and then have a 20-minute break and then have another 80 minutes. So what's going to happen after any questions or discussion is we're going to have about a 20-minute break and then reconvene for the group work, the practicum portion of this session. But I'm open to hear from some of you folks based on your own experiences or based on some of your own knowledge or questions that you have about any of this material, or maybe there's something that your own experience has some insight to shed on some of this. Maybe there's something in here that doesn't look quite right and you want to raise a question about it, or maybe you want to pose a counter position. I would really love to hear from folks online or in the room at this point with any questions about this content or stepping back a little bit about the course more broadly.
I think one note I would say, maybe not a note, but when we were talking about the differences from the 70s to the 90s and to 21st century, I think I've noticed that there seems to be a little more intention to have cooperation with stuff like the Global Compact on refugees. So there's high level discussions about, refugee integration and refugee hosting and responsibility. And then at the same time, we're seeing a lot of that on the ground discourse of being like, no, we want closed borders. So there's kind of a divide happening where you see states being more hospitable and they're trying to promote more international cooperation and restore some kind of balance in that way. And then on the ground level, where their own constituents or their own citizens might not be as open to that. So yeah, there's definitely more of a divide now. It's not like either.
Yeah, remind me your name.
Oh, where the
Ortha.
yeah.
That is a fantastic point, and I'm glad that you brought that up because I remember thinking about that when I was talking about the contrast from that 70s to 90s period versus the 21st century. And I think that you are very right to highlight that because in the in even up to the late 20th century, there was very little actual institutionalized cooperation. Most of the efforts to begin to really coordinate between states to work through global governance institutions like the Global Compact on Migration have really been a 21st century phenomenon. It's really picked up the effort of states to manage this through shared institutions and shared documents to shape and sort of structure principles and practices and policies really is a 21st century
And there's so
phenomenon.
much money involved as well, like so many pledges at the international level. Like in Canada, they keep saying that we're going to take these many more refugees, we're going to put this much more money into building more like habitats, all this stuff. So it's becoming like a huge conversation.
Yes, and I think both of the readings for today also touch on this point that uh, that much of that in some ways the global migration governance is sort of new or late to the scene of global governance. Many other sort of issue areas around the world, trade and security, are considered to be much more advanced and had a lot of this global cooperation and frameworks for global governance in place in the 20th century. This migration issue is seen as coming a little bit later to it. And most of the groundwork and actual cross-border management in any sort of formal way has been 21st century. Of course, the paradox is that the tension is that this is also happening at a time that many societies and political conditions, and especially in Western countries, have been pushing back on it. So you kind of have this split, this almost cognitive dissonance between what states at the establishment level are trying to do and then some of the pushback they're getting in the domestic political sphere from sort of populist issues or often from conservative or more right-wing leaning populations or political parties or governments that are really pushing back against this. So there's a bit of a battle going on for ideas on this right now. Yeah. Did you want to follow up on that or?
No, I just think that that's what I was really trying to get at, that cognitive dissonance.
Yes.
So it's really alarming because yeah, it's kind of like I don't know, it's a real moment of rupture right now. On the norms that we want to push at the international level, what can we do at the domestic level, and then as conflict is building and it's getting more of a common occurrence, just balance.
It absolutely seems like conflict and pressure is making all of these sorts of things more challenging at exactly at the time when we seem to have the institutions in place to manage global migration, and
Yeah,
exactly at the time that there's the greatest need for folks to be crossing borders than ever before, is exactly the time that there's a lot of political challenges that aren't necessarily related strictly to the issue, but are more related to other factors, economic precarity, economic uncertainty, honestly, a lot of sort of misinformation and bad faith public discourses that are working against some of these things. Noura, did you want to jump in? I see a hand.
We've also got Tasnia has.
Sorry, Tasnia.
Yeah, I did want to touch upon some of the points that you just said. I think when I was doing the reading, when I looked at the global population, the percentage of global population that are migrants, it speaks to how much of a scarcity mindset exists in terms of this global discourse on migration. And the few points that you raised about, a lot of right-wing governments using this mindset of migration to win votes. But if you look at, the Refugee Convention and non-signatories of this convention, which are mostly, a lot of these countries are from the global south, they also tend to be the most refugee hosting countries. So, for example, Bangladesh, our government did not sign the convention, but continues to host refugees and then has its own series of issues. But that comparison of governments using that scare tactic of migration or asylum seekers or refugees, whereas they're not the first countries who take in refugees when there's an issue.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And just to quickly touch on something that you said, there is this discourse of scarcity in the most affluent parts of the world. There's nonetheless a seemingly rising sense of there's not enough to go around. And if we start bringing in migrants, they're going to act as drains, straining the social infrastructure, stressing our safety nets. We can't afford this. We must keep our borders closed and look after our own people is kind of the mentality that seems to be prevailing, which is really ironic because we're talking about the most affluent and resource-rich parts of the world. And as you point out, the number of refugees in Canada, massive, well-to-do country, pales in comparison to another couple of examples. The amount of people in Turkey as a proportion of the population, much greater than Canada. And a country like Lebanon, just 4 million people, has a million refugees. Their population swelled to over 5 million because of the displaced people that are residing in the country right now. So it is in fact the global south that is bearing the brunt of the hosting of people in need, and then the doors tend to be closed trying to reach North America and Europe. I'm sorry, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, I think one of the readings mentioned like change from migration management to migration governance, which is kind of what we're discussing. But I find that with governance, especially that is trying to include like so many countries, it almost seems like there is a dilution of responsibility of like countries who have the most money. So yes, there's a lot of commitment of money, as you were saying, but at least in my reading of, for example, like Compass is to make all of these reports and to say all these things like, oh, we're going to do it this way, instead of with a migration management perspective where it's actually committing to specific pathways to do it. So then it's easier to say, like, oh, well, if you're the neighboring country, then you have to let these refugees stay there first, and then it's way harder to actually request asylum or refugees in like countries like Canada, which are like so far away from where the conflicts are happening. So there's something out like that. The bad reputation of migration management versus governance, and how at least in my perspective, governance reduces the responsibility of countries in alone or who have the most power to negotiate these new governance models in the international scale. So yeah, I think it's reflecting on what others are discussing.
Yes. And even as we recognize that things like the Global Compact on migration and all the attention that these institutions of global governance are putting on migration, advancing quotas, encouraging it, trying to combat the discourse. At the same time, I think that the actual measures and policies are weaker than ever because in the 20th century, you had international treaties like the Refugee Convention of 1951, but also the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers, an international treaty from 1990. And these international treaties are considered legally binding. When a country signs on to it, they must demonstrate to the United Nations that they're keeping up their end of the commitment as documented in the treaty. And there are serious, at least in theory and sometimes in practice, consequences for states that don't uphold their end of the treaty. There's some criticism of some of the discourse or some of the global governance institutions today, like the Global Compact on Migration, which was after a sort of a long sort of period of talks and discussions, finally passed through the UN General Assembly in 2018. And it's non-binding. It's not an international treaty. It's basically a statement of aspiration. Basically, this is what we think states ought to do. This is what we think is targets that we should aim for, but as you like. So a lot of leeway to, on the one hand, you can be sympathetic with the type of approach that doesn't try to pursue a binding legal approach because it's a way to get more countries on board. Countries are hesitant to sign things like the 1990 Treaty on the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers because they're afraid of giving up sovereignty. They're afraid of being forced to do something that they believe is against their national interest. So the willingness of countries to sign on to such treaties, and indeed the 1990 treaty has a relatively small number of signatories. Most of the Western countries have not signed on to that treaty for exactly that reason. So this global governance approach is a little bit looser, but perhaps provides a bit of more of a big tent to encourage states to sign on because they don't feel like they're legally bound to something that they'll regret in the future. It gives them a lot of wiggle room to basically back out or to not meet their expected commitments.
Is that like the only reason to give them space? Or what's the point doing something like that? There's so much. Like you don't have to do it at all.
The question is, what's the point if it's not legally binding and if you don't have to actually do it? Is it better than nothing? If there's no international treaty, if you can't get states to agree on a technical, precise, legally binding treaty, is it better to at least provide what could be considered a halfway house or a partial step in the direction? Even though it's non-binding, there's another important aspect, which is normative. So the very sort of political, politicians have to refer to these things, and politicians advocating for migrant rights or more open borders can point to these. Look at the will of the international community. We have the backing of sort of the global democratic position passed through the General Assembly. These are the sorts of values that we want to promote, and they're backed by these documents like the Global Compact. So they carry a lot of normative ethical value, but at the end, but this is the conundrum, is the sort of weighing the non-binding, but getting more countries on board versus sticking to treaties that are binding but will scare away a lot of countries. There's one other point that I think we should really mention that we haven't really mentioned yet. Yeah, there are international obligations through things like the Refugee Convention, and then there are global norms being enacted through like these global compacts. But I think it's a little bit misleading to think of it as sort of just strictly a humanitarian question as to whether or not Western countries accept a lot of migrants or refugees. It's not just a question of being benevolent or trying to say, oh, we should be good-natured and reach out a hand to support, because many of the problems causing the outflow of refugee movements are derived from the policies, the foreign policies, and economic policies of the Western powers. So we're thinking about NATO, we're thinking about the European Union, we're thinking about North America, we're thinking about the United States most of all. It's policies of often strangling foreign economies if they don't cooperate with the Washington consensus, if they don't cooperate with neoliberal notions of economic open borders, free markets, free trade agreements, if a country is not playing ball along those lines, they'll often find themselves isolated internationally, isolated through economic sanctions that the West will impose on them. Well, we don't like the way you're managing your economy, or we don't think it's democratic, we don't think it's liberal, so we're going to put sanctions on your country to punish it. Economic sanctions can have devastating effects on populations around the world. It can lead to political instability. It can lead to people being displaced through conflict or economic need. And the economic sanctions is just one aspect of it. The other is military intervention, the use of Western military power to go to war, to conduct regime change wars for countries that are deemed undemocratic or a threat to international peace and security, are very often destabilizing. These missions, whether we're talking about something like the 20-year invasion, occupation of Afghanistan, or the invasion of Iraq in 2003, or the invasion and the toppling of the government of Libya in 2011, or the covert wars that are waged against countries like Syria, even to some extent countries like Venezuela. Um, uh, all you need to do is look at the country. If you want to know which countries tend to be producing the most amount of displaced people and asylum seekers, they tend, not coincidentally, to be those countries that are targeted by Western sanctions and regime change operations. And that's something that we don't talk about enough in the West. Mainstream public discourse, news media, and general education tends to overlook these issues of responsibility and culpability on the part of Western powers, rather than just treating it as an issue of sort of charity for people in need.
I think sorry, I'm going to
No, please.
I think this realization is something that more people are aware of, but if you talk about the global south, people have accepted this as
Yes.
like, we know they're responsible.
Yes.
And so there's like, when I'm talking about like, what does this do, right? If you have like a really ornate event for the UN and it's about global migration, most of the people who are refugees and migrants who are looking at or who read on it, they're getting very, mad even, because they're like, what's the point of having this conversation? We're the ones who are, affected by these conversations. We're not invited. So I think it's that I'm really like, well, that's why I was interested in joining the courses, because there's such a disconnect in who these conversations are about and who has conversations on behalf of refugees and migrants and asylum seekers. And then with my work, I've noticed that, so like I looked a lot at Pakistan hosting Afghans in that Islamabad border region, and I don't know if you guys are aware, but they deported them to 2023 to 2024. They're deporting Afghans out of Pakistan. They've hosted Afghans since like the Soviet Union, right? So we're seeing the crippling of refugee hosting communities in the South, and that's pretty terrifying to see. It's like a disturbance in the status quo of what people think is acceptable, and what global South countries can endure, just because global North countries say that something should be something. We're seeing a lot of shift in attitudes.
Yes. Yeah.
Actually, one more comment.
Oh, please go ahead. Let's do that.
Yes. So from Okanagan, we have it's interesting to see the changing patterns in migration, and from the statistics, we can see how the figures keep increasing. The fact that migration can't be stopped, and the way many political institutions have adopted migration as a populist idea will never stop or replace it. All these moves have led to changes in these regimes, especially in the global north. And yes, this has limited movement for approved entry points. However, one major result of this is an increase in illegal border crossing, which is not peculiar to the poor countries only. Developed countries now struggle to combat this phenomenon, which seems to have come to stay. I look forward to hearing solutions to this global challenge from the facilitators.
Yes. I hope that we can touch on potential solutions. These are challenging issues. There's a major sort of discourse rising in Western countries, in the United States. Well, you've got to cross legally. well, that it's becoming increasingly difficult for people in need to cross legally. And so it's in a kind of counterintuitive way, increasing the amount of irregular or illicit border crossings. So it is a very challenging problem. Okay.
So, in the chat, Madison's just said, during the break, I briefly skimmed a couple of articles in regards to climate-related migration. It's clear that there's a general consensus internationally that climate migration is an emerging issue and that there is no clear path forward on how to best manage it. One article suggested a revision on the 1951 Refugee Protocol, but reopening this also reopens the possibility of further narrowing rights of refugees. A very complex issue to navigate when there are different state interests and priorities. They've also linked that article in the chat.
Thank you, Madison. We've just looked at your comment on climate migration. I think that's exactly the rub of the issue. Is do we further try and carve up and classify new categories and subcategories of refugee, or should the category of refugee itself be broadened to not be limited to state persecution, which would default include whether you're moving for economic need or climate-induced migration or fleeing war and conflict? The debate on how to handle the climate issue is, should a climate refugee category be established, or should the category of refugee be opened up to include more than just state persecution? There are also debates about just how many people are moving primarily or specifically because of climate-induced factors. I haven't seen this particular article, but there might be some excellent information in there. Thank you, Madison.